Higher.
Ew.
Mira.
Longer. Faster.
Cyfle yma.
Gwrando.
Listen.
Engage. Cysylltu.
Cynrychioli.
Represent.
Okay, welcome to another edition of the Autumn Coach Development Series. My name's Liz Davis and I lead on the Junior Endurance Programme for Welsh Athletics. Today I'm going to be talking a bit about developing the junior endurance athlete and supporting athlete progression. So this is kind of a part two to the webinar that I did back in June. Okay, some session objectives. Apologies about that, just a bit slow there with the computer. So just wanted to recap on the early event group endurance athlete that we talked about back in June. So that 14 to 16-year-old athlete who's just perhaps coming into the event group from that foundation stage. Then we're going to touch on where do we go next with that event group level endurance athlete. So when the athlete's getting to around about that 16, 17 years old, what are our options in terms of training prescription? And linked to that then will be a discussion on the developing profiles of a junior endurance athlete and then how this can influence the training prescription. And then some stumbling blocks and some perhaps some coaching questions. So questions we should maybe ask ourselves when we're working with this age group of athlete. So just a bit of a recap then. So we'll go back to our athlete development pyramid, which I showed in the last webinar. So obviously we talked last time about this event group athlete. So this athlete who was moving from that foundation stage into the event group. And again, there being a very much a process focus to that athlete's training, and also you know, keeping the variety with them training across various distances. But I know my key message from last time was build the solid foundations for this sort of athlete. So again, just recapping there. So again, that athlete's age roughly around that 14 to 15-year-old. And our priorities in terms of the physiology and the movement were prioritizing maximum speed and getting the mechanics right with that. Looking at that aerobic development, starting to put those foundations in place for the aerobic system. And then we touched upon also long-term anaerobic development, knowing that these younger athletes will have not necessarily the most developed anaerobic system, however, close to those kind of competition phases is starting to introduce a little bit of race pace work. So yeah, again, going back to that solid foundations, build the physical preparation base, emphasizing that good technical model at all speeds. And the most important thing at this level is giving our athletes options. So we talk very much about not boxing the athlete into being an 800-meter runner or a 3K runner at this early stage. So definitely laying the solid foundations and giving our athletes options. So again, looking at who we want to discuss today. So we're going to talk a little about the later stage of the event group endurance athlete. So athlete who's moving into not yet quite the event specialism, but as we'll talk about shortly, is starting to develop perhaps a certain profile towards a given event. And this sort of athlete, we'll call them the late stage event group endurance athlete. And we're talking about an athlete who's roughly, as I said earlier, between about 16 to 18 years old, but I'd say circa 17, just to put a figure on it. And again, we do need to still consider training stage. So you could have athletes coming in who are quite early development into that age category. However, again, for the purpose of this presentation, we'll, as I've got down the bottom, talk about an athlete who's got around about a 2 to 3 year training history in the endurance event group and or longer sprints. This sort of athlete, puberty is generally ended, and in most cases, the physiology of this sort of athlete has become that of an adult, and there may still be a little bit more anaerobic development to go. But the key thing is they perhaps start and show attributes towards a particular endurance event. And as I just said earlier, that's not necessarily that we should push an athlete to specialise in an endurance event at this age group, but there's definitely going to be some attributes which we'll touch upon shortly, which you'll start to see in your young athlete. Again, keeping the holistic approach, in context, is this sort of athlete will again have school pressures we talked about with that earlier age group athlete, with maybe A levels, or potentially for some athletes start of employment. They will in some cases be, or in many cases, be preparing for university transition, and also building that bit more independence from parents, so much more social and lifestyle independence. This kind of athlete will start to demonstrate, and that might be things like they can drive themselves to training. As I said, there's more options to go out independently with friends, etc. And this is a type of athlete we'd likely see on our national development programme. So going back to that youth physical development model, because I know we've referred to this in the last presentation. So this athlete will be in this sort of 16 to 18-year-old category. The key thing is, as I said earlier, they're going to have got usually past their peak height velocity, and there's going to be a general decline in growth rate. So this athlete is near enough getting to the size and development stage of what they will be as an adult. And the other key thing on this athlete development model is as they move into this age group, they're likely to need a little bit more structure and a little bit more individualization to training. So the training needs to become a little bit more bespoke, which I showed on the athlete development model, athlete development pyramid earlier on. As the athlete moves through the pathway, the individualization of training becomes a little bit more important. Again, exactly the same, for the boys, and as I touched upon in the last presentation, the boys just tend to have that slightly later development than the girls. So that's just something to consider of whether we need to start to become a bit more individual, this athlete, or do they need a more general build the solid foundations approach. So my message to you last time was very much build solid foundations. Today we're going to be about talking a little bit more about coaching the athlete in front of you. So as I said, trying to become that a little bit more individualized with the approach we take, as well as considering obviously we have to work usually within sort of group setups as well. And again, as always, considering the athlete-centered approach. So I brought this slide into my previous presentation about very much the athlete being at the center of all these individual attributes that we want to develop around them, and keeping that very, very holistic approach. I'm aware, because there's so much to talk about with this level of athlete, that we could have a very, very long presentation on our hands if I touched on all these individual components. But I think the key things I'm going to touch upon today are more around the physiology, training, prescription. So the speed, power development, aerobic development of this stage of athlete. So again, hopefully there's some elements of this we covered in the last presentation anyway. But as I said, I think for the purposes of being a bit specific in this presentation, we will touch upon these key physiological attributes. Okay, so starting to think about, as I said, the individualization of training, but piecing together your athlete's physical profile. So I've got some questions you can start to perhaps ask yourself as a coach about the athletes that you are coaching, and what kind of profile that might be starting to be developed in that athlete. So first question is I've got here is, how is your athlete's raw speed in the technical model? So has your athlete got a natural level of raw speed? And again, ways to assess this would be obviously looking at their speed in training. So maybe a 50-meter sprint test, or you may have if they've got an interest in sprints, they may have been competing over 100 meters. But I think that's quite important when we talk about the different profiles that we'll come across shortly. Also, when you're looking at that physical profile, is how do they perform over various distances? So this could be anything from 100 meters all the way through to 3,000, or maybe a 5K road time. So where of these distances is your athlete starting to perform well? Because again, that could give you a little bit of an idea of, okay, is this athlete quite aerobic biased? They do very well over cross country and maybe longer distances, but in the shorter distance, they struggle to generate that raw speed. Or is your athlete, again, at the other end of that spectrum, where they've got a very, very good raw speed, but they do struggle with that kind of those longer distances, and when things get more aerobic. The visual or the observation of your athlete is quite important. So how do they react off the ground? Are they good at producing force? Are they good at using stored energy? Are they elastic in the way they move? I think that's quite important. The physicality in the build as well. So as your athlete naturally put on muscle, and also then finally looking at that kind of perhaps the hurdle and steeple ability. So as your athlete demonstrating good abilities over hurdles, or is that something that again you as a coach need to consider working on? So asking those questions can start to kind of give you an understanding of potentially the type of profile that you could come across with your athletes. So for purposes of this presentation, I've divided the athletes a little bit into a speed endurance type athlete, and also maybe an aerobic engine type athlete, because these are the types of athletes that I personally tend to see. You've got an athlete there who's got good raw speed under the speed endurance. So generally, again, they're shorter distance or shorter sort of or longer sprint times, I should say, can be fairly strong, and they often like competing over those short distances as well. They tend to be quite elastic in the way they move. So again, good return from the ground, good ability to produce that force. They often thrive, these type of athletes, from an endurance point of view, over 8s and 15s. And 3Ks and cross country, they perhaps aren't necessarily as strong. However, I put the caveat there that they can be athletes who do perform well over those longer distances as well. But just on average, you'll sort of see that that type of athlete will be perhaps less strong over those longer distances, and when they can't use that stored energy that I talked about. The aerobic engine type athlete is the other profile that we start to see, and that kind of athlete generally struggles to generate raw speeds. They generally don't have a very fast maximal speed, and they also struggle to generate that power to do that. These athletes tend to again be a little bit less reactive off the ground, so a bit more type 1 fiber dominant. So again, don't necessarily utilize the stored energy as effectively as and as springy as a speed endurance athlete. These athletes tend to thrive a bit better in competition as the distances increase, or they might be stronger over that kind of off-track kind of cross-country disciplines. And often you see this type of athlete that they recover very quickly from effort. So they tend to be the type of athlete that they're ready to go very quickly for the next repetition, regardless of the distance and regardless of the speed. Okay, so when we look at optimizing training, what I would say is, we still have to consider that there are many roads to get to the same outcome. However, there are, we'll talk about shortly is that for those different profiles, there can be certain approaches that perhaps can be more effective. And I think that's the key thing we need to consider with this level of athlete is the training we're putting in front of them optimizing their strengths and also their weaknesses. So going back to, I want to touch upon the sort of 6-zone training model, because this is something we introduced in my previous webinar, but also is talked quite eloquently about by Dan as well. And this 6-zone training model is very much been adapted within Welsh Athletics and also within the coaching community within endurance to start discussing certain types of training sessions. And again, one of the reasons around that was to try and get some common language. As we all know, when we discuss physiology and we look at papers or articles, etc., on physiology, is that you can get very lost in the jargon, and there's a lot of ways to describe the same thing, basically. So again, just to recap on this, obviously we've got the 6 zones, starting with the zones 1 and 2, which sit below that first threshold, which we deem the lactic threshold. And then obviously as that anaerobic contribution increases, then we get to that lactic turn point, and then we're looking at the zones 4, 5 and 6, which sit above that turn point, with VO2 max sitting at the top there with zone 5. And again, there's some descriptions which again I touched upon in the last presentation around that 6-zone model, and what each zone could be described as, the level of exertion, if you're looking at sort of perceived exertion and breathing reference, etc., but also kind of a rough idea of the heart rate percentage that you'd be working at within those zones as well. So very much with the early event group level athlete, we talked about those key priorities, and the first priority was to develop, as we said, maximal speed, so making sure that we were getting our athletes to run as fast as they could, as well as they could in terms of technical model. We talked about building the aerobic system, and as we discussed in that particular presentation, is part of that will be developing the easy volume, so the zones 1 and 2, which is again below that first threshold. And then we had a discussion around what way we could maximize that aerobic capacity, so whether we'd use zone 4 or zone 5, and we very much emphasized in that presentation that zone 5 works, so this hard kind of work roughly around your VO2 max would be more preferable in younger developing athletes moving into that event group, partly because the sessions tend to be shorter and a little bit quicker, so therefore maintaining that good movement pattern and technical model whilst stressing the aerobic system. So again, we looked at the benefits versus risks of using zone 4 as well, and obviously zone 5 in that younger athlete was seen as the most beneficial. But zone 4, as our athletes progress through the system and they build more volume and they're able to absorb more volume, is definitely something that we should consider, and you know, is another option to, I say, build that aerobic capacity and help shift those thresholds. So zone 4, as we term, is a tempo zone. It occasionally is called threshold zone, etc. But again, for the purposes, we're going to call it tempo. And again, as Dan Nash nicely described in his presentation, zone 4 tends to be this sweet spot between volume and intensity. So obviously these sessions in zone 4 require a bit more volume than they would in zone 5. However, the trade-off there is the sessions also tend to be less intense, so you can accumulate more volume within a given session, which is quite important when you're trying to grow the base of that aerobic system. Improving is also one of the key outcomes of zone 4 is that it does improve the body's ability to buffer anaerobic waste products, so improves that or shifts that lactic turn point so that you can work for longer aerobically or without accumulating too much anaerobic waste product. This type of session can be performed on track or tarmac loops, especially if you're looking at keeping things controlled and at a set pace, but also can be performed as well over an undulating grass loop, where the athlete can perhaps focus on the perceived effort a little bit more and not worry too much about pace, but can keep that under control. We've got, so in terms of that talk test, the athlete should still be able to say a few words in this zone. So they should still be able to say a few words to you as a coach or individuals around them. So they're not working at that maximal point where they're unable to say very much at all. And again, from a perceived effort out of 10, so if you rate 0 being no exertion, 10 being a flat out effort, that effort is very controlled, so we're looking around a 7 out of 10. And a good way, if you're using perceived effort in this zone, is to maybe start the efforts around 5 out of 10 with the kind of effort accumulating through the session, so the athlete's final reps will be 7 out of 10. But you don't really want to exceed that with this type of work. And again, going back to pacing apps and tables, so things like the VDOT, Jack Daniels tables can be useful for setting a pace in this particular zone, especially in the absence of being able to go into a sort of a lab environment. And again, session examples. So it's a key thing to say about zone 4 work, and what certainly Welsh Athletics would advocate with zone 4 work is, if you're introducing this into the programs of your endurance athletes, is timed efforts and distance efforts, but also broken down efforts. Really, really important. That it's very unlikely athletes at this stage are going to be able to maintain long periods of threshold tempo work. They're likely to just get a bit slower, and they're not going to stay in the zone and get the adaptations that you want. So in terms of controlling effort, the other thing to note on these examples as well is the short recovery. So the short recovery will mean that your athlete cannot work, they're going to struggle to work very hard, because the recovery will be short. So if they're accumulating a lot of or utilizing a lot of the anaerobic system, they're not going to recover in that period of time. So yeah, the short recoveries, and often keeping those recoveries active as well, can ensure that athlete doesn't drift towards that kind of zone 5 area, where the session will have to keep basically be shorter, and the volume of that session will be shorter as well. So going back to some general training prescription guidance with an athlete who's moving through the pathway. So an athlete who now, as I said, has got a couple of years training history behind them, and we're trying to be perhaps a bit more specific, a bit more individualized with their training. I think the key thing, as I will keep emphasizing in this presentation, is think about the athlete in front of you. That's very important. The individualization of training prescription is going to have to increase. And just general sessions for this type of athlete, and trying to have a one-size-fits-all approach may result in them not continuing to improve. So this sort of athlete as well, and I know in the when we looked at the early event group athlete in endurance, we touched upon very much keeping it around how does the athlete feel, how is it effort, how, rather than perhaps introducing too many kind of set parameters. But I think with this sort of athlete, if they've got the ability and they've got access to something like a Garmin or a watch, sports watches, they can start to kind of maybe use some of those parameters to control training intensity, especially as volume increases. So again, what I would advocate, and I know there's a bit of debate in literature about this, but for sort of zones 1 and 2, so that submaximal work would be sort of using heart rate to control, or heart rate zones to control that work. And also then as you move to zones 4 to 6, you're looking at more pace, because the heart rates are generally going to be quite high here, and then the recoveries, you're going to get heart rate lags, etc. So I think keeping that pace as a focus for 4 to 6 is quite important. And as I said previously, you can use things like Daniels tables, etc., which can be quite useful for setting certain parameters, or even working off, as I said, for zone 6, working off your kind of your race pace, target paces, etc. This type of athlete, you would be looking to try and increase their training to 6 days a week. Again, you'd have to look at the athlete in front of you and what other commitments, etc. They have in front of them. But I think if the athlete's going to keep progressing through the system, they do need to kind of consider how many days training they are doing. That goes on to always the question when athletes get to kind of that 17, 18-year-old point is, should they be doing double day training? And again, there's no right or wrong answer to this, but as I talked about, as the volume of training needs to increase and you need to fit in the components, double day training may need to become an option for your athlete. But I think that should always be a individual coach decision, individual athlete decision, because as I said, with the athletes at this stage, with all the other lifestyle components they've got, to contend with, double day training may not be something that's suitable, and consistency would be the thing you'd be looking for. I think at this stage as well, you do need to think about your increased accountability from your athletes, training diaries, and feeding back on training, and perhaps them uploading training onto certain apps so you can actually view that is quite important, because there needs to be, when the volume and the intensity of training increases, you definitely need to be keeping a close eye on whether the athlete's reacting to training. But that also comes from your athlete feeding back as well. And also things like recovery. Is your athlete able to recover from those sessions? Are they being accountable with their recovery, or are they preferring perhaps social activities instead of recovery, which may then obviously mean that they're not ready for training the next day. But that again comes down to the athlete in front of you and what they can and can't cope with, and what their own personal goals are really. But yeah, I think increased athlete accountability does start to come into play as athletes move through the system. Okay, so some factors to consider. So we did say at the start we were going to more focus on the kind of physiology element of training prescription in this discussion. And I want to then think about the individual profiles, or the profiles we talked about earlier on. And first of all, I want to touch upon this kind of aerobic engine type athlete. So as I said, the athlete's got a bit of a more bias to the kind of perhaps longer distance events. And again, is a type of athlete who thrives on that kind of aerobic work, perhaps the less reactive athlete, and the one who struggles to develop raw or generate raw speed. What I will say is all zones, apart from, I will say, zone 3 will be probably of benefit to this athlete. And the volume with this type of athlete needs to start to be built. So this type of athlete is unlikely to be able to have a very huge speed reserve. So they're going to need to grow that aerobic system, which will then mean grow in the sessions. And this is where zone 4 sessions with this type of athlete can be quite useful, as I said, because you can increase the volume within those sessions without having too much intensity, mixed in with that. So yeah, I think that's key to say with these aerobic type athletes is you can probably only maximize their speed to a certain point, but power is still important. So keeping that zone 6 work in, those short hills, that short speed work can help to, as I said, improve things like their running economy. It's very unlikely to kind of make them a lot faster, but it's definitely something from an economy point of view which will be very useful to have in that athlete's training, that ability to still generate power. From a speed endurance point of view then, so that speed endurance biased athlete, this can be a trickier athlete to work out exactly what what that training approach is, and it may take time to work out with this athlete what balance of zones, I suppose, is required. And this sort of athlete, you might start to see an athlete who perhaps has more of a bias towards kind of longer sprints in 800, so a 4-8 type athlete, or maybe that kind of 800, 1500 athlete who may just need a bit more of aerobic elements to their training. So I think with this type of athlete, you're probably more likely to get good return with zones 1, 2, 5 and 6. I think zone 4 then, so that kind of more drawn out volume type session, it will very much depend on the athlete's attributes, but also your coaching philosophy. And I'll touch upon 3 examples shortly where, you know, zone 4 is used with this type of individual. But I think the key thing with a speed endurance athlete is definitely maximizing their strength, and one of their strengths is usually their raw speed, the ability to be good reactive off the ground, generate good force, etc. So definitely should be looking at, you know, the balance between building too much volume with this type of athlete versus trying to maximize their speed as well. So I say 3 different training approaches, all potentially good outcomes. So, you know, I've got 3 examples here of that speed endurance type athlete, and perhaps how they, you know, types of approaches to coaching them. You can obviously look at your 1500 meter type athlete who's on quite high mileage, and you know, they do a fair amount of work in zones 1 to 4. I'd say probably the best example of that is the Ingebrigtsens. If you read a lot about their training, that tends to be where they sit with a lot of their training, and then that zone 6 is mainly peppered in around that sort of pre-competition phase. So there's quite a big focus there on developing the aerobic system with that athlete. Then you've got the kind of athlete then who perhaps, you know, again, that 8 type 15 athlete who's on more moderate mileage. So again, zones 1, 2, 5 and 6 tend to be more their bias, very little zone 4 if any, but also then they focus on that kind of maximum speed work as well. And then again, the final type approach that you can also see is that kind of 4-8 type athlete who's competes mainly over 800 meters, but is on quite a low running volume. So they tend to maximize work in zone 6, working on max speed and you know, that kind of anaerobic development. And their zone 5 sessions, they don't have long drawn out sessions. They tend to be quite short, sharp zone 5 sessions working around that VO2 max. So, you know, as I alluded to previously, that kind of speed endurance athlete, they're trickier in a sense in that there's not one approach that will suit. And as I'll go on to now, is around how does your athlete tick, basically, and it's trying to work out which components of these, which components of those zones and how much of those zones you need to use with your athlete, and that can take time to work that out. I think that's another message to get across. So again, I introduced this slide again in the last presentation. It looked at an athlete with small versus large aerobic foundations. That 4-8 athlete we just described, you know, who's got a very good speed reserve, that type of athlete could possibly get away with having that smaller aerobic foundation because they have, as I said, quite a high level of raw speed and a good speed reserve, so they can run comfortably at faster speeds just by the nature of them having that attribute. But many of the athletes, like I said, you're trying to look at developing that large aerobic foundation, and most athletes, as I said, who are doing endurance events will need that. So that's something to consider, that if a lot of your training is quite intense and quite fast, that a large aerobic that large aerobic foundation is unlikely to be built. And that's sometimes when we can start to see plateaus, is when, you know, that kind of foundation isn't being built. So again, as I said, what makes your athlete tick? I think that's really important to ask that question. What is that kind of profile you're starting to see in that young athlete? And what sort of training do you feel might be beneficial? And I've given some guidelines there, but I say there isn't really a right or wrong answer. But the key thing is you start to question that as a coach. I say frequent challenges at this age group is potentially not appreciate the profile of the athlete in front of you and having a one-size-fits-all approach. And, you know, that athlete then is unlikely to maximize their strengths, or is only likely to improve if they fit maybe your coaching philosophy. Then we talk about the dreaded plateau, when athletes get to this is quite common that we see athletes starting to plateau, and that can sometimes be, I mean, that's multifaceted, but that can be, due to the fact that we're not, developing the right aerobic system within those athletes, or we're not growing that system and underneath that athlete. And again, as a result of that, it tends to be quite a common age group, age for dropout, especially in girls. And again, that can come from girls having a lot of body changes, and again, just needing to adapt that training during that time. This athlete also will, training prescription needs to be taken into consideration. University and exams, etc., need to be taken into consideration with training prescription, because again, just need to know how much your athlete can actually manage in terms of training load, and that kind of, as I said, that individualization of what you're trying to do. Because again, too much training and not the right balance, plus all the other stresses this kind of athlete's got within their life, again, could either mean a plateau, or it could mean a growing disinterest in the sport and a lack of enjoyment in their training, but also in their competition. So again, going to some coaching questions. As I said, what is your coaching philosophy, and how can it be adapted to suit the athlete in front of you? So, have you got an approach which suits the athlete, and also how can you then adapt the way you think and the prescription of training for that particular athlete? What then do you need to know and understand to develop the athlete in front of you? So we've all come to coaching with our different knowledge bases, our different understandings of training, physiology, etc. So is there something that you need to maybe learn or understand better to develop the athlete? Also, how many athletes can you coach with a level of detail? As athletes move through the system, you're definitely going to have to start to become a lot more specific. Training plans can take longer to do, because you're trying to kind of fit in some of these individual components, put that jigsaw together. So how many athletes can you feasibly coach with that level of detail? Because if you need to be honest, or we need to be honest as coaches with how much we can do with that level of detail. Okay, just some summary points then for this this later event group stage athlete is: coach the athlete in front of you. What is the profile of athlete you're starting to see? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the athlete in front of you? Considering all zones in your training prescription. So, you can start to think about that zone 4 as the athlete in front of you potentially is accumulating more volume. It may or may not always be appropriate, as we've already discussed, but it's something definitely to consider. And again, key thing is, what can you do as a coach to maximize your athlete's ability to progress? So what do you need to know? What do you need to understand to maximize, that progression, as we said, through the pathway? Again, thank you for listening. If you do need any further information, or you've got any questions off the back of what we discussed today, again, my name's Liz Davis, and as you can see, there's my email address at the bottom of the page. So if you have any questions off the back of this, please, again, don't hesitate to get in touch. Okay, many thanks for listening, and I hope to see you all soon, and take care.